The station called Axis Primara floated in the empty space between three dying stars. It was the largest structure ever built by living hands. Its metal halls stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, and its lights could be seen from passing ships like a second sun. Every 10 years, the most powerful beings in the galaxy gathered here for one purpose. They came to decide who mattered and who did not. The Grand Conclave Hall sat at the heart of the station. It was a massive circular room with seats rising up in rings like the inside of a bowl. The ceiling was made of clear glass, and through it the stars looked down on the creatures below. Thousands of delegates filled those seats. They came from 14 species, each one older and more powerful than the next. Their ships filled the docking bays outside. Some species had sent 50 representatives, others had sent 100. They wore bright robes and heavy armor and flowing garments made from materials that did not exist on most worlds. The Dralith delegation sat in the highest ring. They were tall and thin, with scales that shifted color in the light like oil on water. Their eyes were large and golden, and they moved with the slow grace of creatures who had never needed to rush. They had been part of the Concordance for over 6,000 years. They considered themselves the intellectual center of the galaxy, and very few beings had ever dared to disagree. Below them sat the Gorvon. They were the opposite of the Dralith in almost every way. Massive creatures with skin like cracked stone, they had been warriors since before most species had learned to make fire. Their ambassador, a giant named Torek, sat with his arms folded across his chest. His face, if it could be called a face, showed nothing, but his dark eyes moved slowly across the room, watching everything. The Velshi were there too, small and quick, with 4 arms and nervous energy that made them twitch in their seats. The Urani floated in sealed tanks of green liquid, their tentacles pressed against the glass as they observed. The Kreth sat perfectly still, their insect-like bodies clicking softly in what might have been conversation. Species after species, race after race, all of them ancient, all of them proud. And then there was the human. He sat alone in the lowest ring, in a section meant for 30 delegates. The other 29 seats were empty. His name was Elias Morrow, and he was the only representative that Earth had sent. He was not tall. He was not impressive to look at. He wore a simple dark uniform with no decorations, no medals, and no symbols of rank beyond a small silver pin on his collar. His hair was gray at the edges, and his hands, which rested quietly on a plain datapad, were covered in old scars. The aliens around him noticed. Of course they noticed. A Velshi delegate leaned toward a companion and whispered something. The companion looked down at Elias and made a sound that was very close to laughter. A Kreth clicked its mandibles in what the translator systems registered as mild contempt. Sending one representative to the conclave was either a statement of supreme confidence or a confession of irrelevance. The aliens could not decide which one applied to the human, so most of them settled on the second option. Elias did not seem to care. He scrolled through his datapad, reading something, making occasional notes with a stylus. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, not a man who was about to argue for the future of his entire species. The purpose of this particular conclave was simple but important. Humanity had applied for full membership in the Galactic Concordance. They had been probationary members for 84 years, which was barely a breath of time by galactic standards. No species had ever been granted full membership in under 300 years. Most took longer. The idea that humans thought they were ready was, to many in the hall, either amusing or insulting. The session began with the traditional presentations. Each species was invited to showcase their greatest contributions to galactic civilization. The Dralith went first. Their lead scientist stepped to the central platform, and the air above her filled with a holographic display of their newest creation, a device that could stabilize dying stars and extend their life by millions of years. The hall erupted in polite, impressed applause. The Dralith delegate bowed and returned to her seat with the calm satisfaction of someone who already knew she was the smartest person in the room. The Gorvon went next. Ambassador Torek himself stood and presented their planet shield array, a defensive system that could wrap an entire world in a barrier of compressed gravity. It had saved 3 colonies during the last Void Storm season. The applause was louder this time, mixed with deep rumbles of respect from the warrior species in attendance. One by one, the species took their turns. The Velshi showed off their communication network that could send messages across the galaxy in seconds. The Urani demonstrated a biological technology that could purify entire oceans. Each presentation was grander than the last, each one a reminder of what these ancient civilizations had built over thousands and thousands of years. Elias watched each one. He did not applaud, but he did not look bored either. He simply watched, and occasionally he wrote something on his datapad. Finally, the rotation reached the human section. A chime sounded, and a calm, automated voice announced that the representative of Earth was invited to present humanity's contributions to galactic welfare. Elias set down his stylus. He started to stand. But before he could take a single step, another voice cut through the hall. "If the conclave permits," the voice said, smooth and clear, and carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had never been told no, "I would like to exercise the right of preliminary assessment before the human representative speaks." Every head in the hall turned upward to the highest ring. High Adjudicator Salith Voron stood at the edge of her platform, looking down at the hall below. She was tall even for a Draelith, and her scales shimmered between deep blue and silver as the light touched them. Her golden eyes were fixed on the small figure in the lowest ring. On Elias Morrow, who sat back down slowly and folded his hands over his datapad. The hall buzzed with whispered conversation. The preliminary assessment was an old rule, rarely used. It allowed the High Adjudicator to evaluate a candidate species before they even had a chance to speak. It was meant to save the conclave's time by removing clearly unworthy applicants. It had not been used in over 1,000 years. Torek shifted in his seat, his stone fingers tightening on the armrest. He looked down at the human and then up at the Draelith, and something heavy and troubled moved behind his ancient eyes. Salith smiled. It was a beautiful smile, the kind that had no warmth in it at all. "Thank you," she said. "This will not take long." Salith Voron descended from the highest ring with the slow, measured steps of someone who wanted every eye in the room to follow her. And they did. Her scales caught the light from the glass ceiling and threw soft blue reflections across the faces of the delegates sitting nearby. She reached the central platform, the same platform where the greatest minds of 14 species had just displayed wonders that could reshape worlds, and she stood there as if it had been built for her alone. She did not carry a datapad. She did not activate any holographic display. She simply folded her long fingers in front of her and looked out at the conclave with those wide golden eyes. "Fellow delegates," she began, and her voice filled the hall without effort. The Draelith had been born to speak in places like this. Their vocal cords could produce sounds that resonated in the chest of every creature that heard them. It was not magic. It was biology, but the effect was the same. "We are gathered to consider a question that, in my judgment, should not require much consideration at all." She paused and let the silence do its work. "The species called humanity has requested full membership in this concordance. They have been among us for 84 years. 84 years. She repeated the number slowly, letting it hang in the air. "My own grandmother's greenhouse contains plants that are older than humanity's presence in this galaxy, and yet they come before us today and ask to be called equals." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through parts of the hall. Not everyone laughed, but enough did. Salith began to walk in a slow circle around the platform. "Let us examine what we know about this species. I will try to be fair. I will try to be thorough. And I will try," she added, with a glance down at the lowest ring, "to be brief. Since I understand humans do not have a great deal of time." The laughter was louder this time. "Their lifespan, Salith said, holding up one slender finger. The average human lives for approximately 80 to 90 standard years. Some of you in this hall have individual memories that are older than their entire civilization. They flicker into existence, burn for a moment, and then they are gone. What permanence can such creatures offer to an institution that thinks in ages? She raised a second finger. Their homeworld, a single planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star at the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm. Before they ever left that world, they had already poisoned its air, stripped its forests, melted its ice, and fought thousands of wars upon its surface. They nearly destroyed themselves not once, not twice, but repeatedly across their history. They are, by their own records, the greatest threat their own planet has ever faced. She let that settle. In the middle rings, several delegates exchanged looks and nodded. Their technology, a third finger. I want to be generous here, so I will say this plainly. Human technology is not original. Their faster-than-light drive is based on Velshi wave theory. Their medical systems borrow heavily from Urani biological frameworks. Their weapons are simplified versions of Gorvan impact designs. They are talented at combining the work of others. I will grant them that. But there is a word for a species that builds its house entirely from borrowed materials. She tilted her head. I believe even humans have a word for it. More laughter, this time from nearly every section of the hall. Elias Morrow sat perfectly still. His hands had not moved from his datapad. His expression had not changed. If the words bothered him, nothing on his face showed it. A few delegates noticed this. Most did not. Salith was not finished. And then there is the matter of their nature. She stopped walking and faced the hall directly. Her voice dropped, becoming more serious. This is, I think, the most important point. Every great species in this concordance has one thing in common, unity. The Draelith speak with one voice. The Gorvan march as one army. The Velshi think as one network. But humans... She shook her head slowly, and her scales dimmed to a muted gray, which was the Draelith expression of sadness or pity. Humans cannot agree on anything. They are fractured by language, fractured by borders, fractured by ideology, by religion, by the color of their own skin. They fight among themselves with the same energy that other species reserve for external enemies. They have more words for division than any species in our records. She turned and looked directly at Elias. How can a species that cannot unite itself presume to represent itself within a galactic community? How can a species that cannot even find peace on a single world offer peace to a galaxy? The hall was quiet now. The laughter had faded, replaced by something more serious. Many delegates were nodding. Even those who had no strong opinion about humans were being pulled along by the weight of her words. She was, after all, the high adjudicator. She had been chosen for this role because she was the finest legal mind the Draelith had produced in 3 generations. And right now, she was using every bit of that talent to take humanity apart piece by piece. Salith straightened. Her scales brightened back to silver blue. She had one more thing to say. I do not say these things out of cruelty, she said, and her voice was softer now, almost kind. That was the most dangerous tone of all. Humans are a curious species. They have energy, they have spirit. They have a certain reckless charm that I think many of us find entertaining. But entertainment is not contribution. Charm is not capability. And spirit, however admirable, is not a substitute for substance. She folded her hands again. It is my formal recommendation as High Adjudicator of this conclave that humanity's application for full membership be denied. They are not ready. They may never be ready. But they are, and I say this with genuine respect, a minor species. Spirited, yes, but minor. She turned to face Elias one final time. The platform lights were on her, and she looked in that moment like something carved from light itself. The conclave thanks the human representative for his attendance, she said, with a small bow that was perfectly polite and perfectly empty. If he wishes to offer a brief rebuttal before the vote, he is of course welcome to do so. Though I would understand if he preferred to simply accept the assessment and save us all some time. She smiled again, that cold, beautiful smile. The hall waited. Thousands of eyes, many of them not eyes at all but sensors and receptors and light-catching organs of a dozen different designs, all focused on the lowest ring, on the single human sitting among 29 empty chairs. Elias Morrow looked down at his datapad. He tapped the screen once gently and closed whatever file he had been reading. He set the stylus down beside it, lining it up neatly with the edge. He took a breath, not a deep one, not a dramatic one, just a breath, the kind a man takes before he stands up from a table and walks to the door. Then he smiled. It was a small smile, quiet and steady. It was not angry. It was not nervous. It was the kind of smile that a person gives when they know something that nobody else in the room has figured out yet. Ambassador Torek, watching from above, felt something shift in his chest. He had seen that kind of smile before. He had seen it on the faces of the human rescue teams that had come to his world decades ago, walking into radiation zones with nothing but thin suits and stubborn determination. It was not the smile of someone who had been defeated. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Elias pushed back his chair and stood up. The hall held its breath. Elias Morrow did not walk quickly to the platform. He did not walk slowly either. He walked the way a man walks when he has no interest in performing for anyone. His boots made soft, steady sounds on the metal floor, and in the enormous silence of the conclave hall, every step was heard clearly. He reached the central platform and stepped up onto it. The lights adjusted automatically, brightening around him the way they had brightened around every other speaker. But where the Draelith had seemed to glow under those lights, Elias simply looked like what he was. A tired man in a plain uniform, standing in a room full of giants. He did not look at Salith. He did not look at the delegates in the upper rings. He looked straight ahead, at no one in particular, and he was quiet for a moment. The silence made some of the delegates uncomfortable. A Velshi shifted in his seat. A Kreth clicked softly. Then Elias spoke. The High Adjudicator is right. His voice was not loud. It did not resonate in the chest like a Draelith voice. It did not boom like a Gorvon war call. It was just a voice, plain and human, carried by the hall's amplification systems to every ear and receptor in the room. The words themselves caused more confusion than anything Salith had said. Delegates looked at each other. The Draelith in the upper ring exchanged glances of surprise. Even Salith, who had returned to her platform, tilted her head slightly. She is right about almost everything, Elias continued. He put his hands behind his back, not in a military posture but in the way a man does when he wants to keep them still. We are short-lived. That is true. Most of us will never see 100 years. By the standards of this room, we are born and we die in what must seem like the blink of an eye. He nodded slowly, as if agreeing with himself. Our homeworld is fragile. That is also true. We damaged it badly before we learned to take care of it. We fought wars on it. We poisoned parts of it. We made terrible mistakes and we made them over and over again. I will not pretend otherwise. A few delegates leaned forward. This was not what they had expected. A rebuttal was supposed to be a defense, an argument, a counterattack. This sounded like a man agreeing with his own execution. Our technology, Elias said, borrowed, adapted, combined from the work of species that had thousands of years of head start on us. The adjudicator is correct. We did not invent the wave drive. We did not create biological purification. We learned from those who came before us, and we are not ashamed of that, but it is the truth. He paused. He looked down at the platform floor for a moment, and then he looked up again. And we are divided. That might be the most true thing the adjudicator said. Humans argue. We disagree. We split into groups and fight over things that other species settled long before they reached the stars. Language, belief, identity, purpose. We have never spoken with one voice. We probably never will. The hall was still confused. Some delegates had already begun to write off the humans' rebuttal as a surrender. A Velshi in the middle ring tapped a note into a device, probably a message to a colleague that said the vote would be quick. But Ambassador Torek had not moved. His dark eyes were locked on the small figure on the platform, and his massive stone hands were very, very still. He was listening, not to the words, to what was underneath them. "So," Elias said, and something in his voice shifted. It was subtle. It was not louder. It was not harder. But it was different, the way the air feels different just before a storm when the wind has not yet started but you can feel that it is coming. "If all of that is true, and it is, then you might wonder why I am standing here at all." He took his hands from behind his back. "You might wonder why a species that lives for 80 years thinks it belongs in a room with species that live for thousands. You might wonder why a species that nearly killed itself on its own planet thinks it has something to offer a galaxy. You might wonder why a species that cannot even agree on what to eat for dinner thinks it can sit at this table." A few nervous laughs, but fewer than before. "I will tell you why," Elias said, "but first I want to talk about time." He began to walk, not in the deliberate, theatrical circle that Salith had made, but in the aimless, thoughtful way of a man working something out in his head. "The adjudicator said that humans flicker, that we are here and then we are gone. She is right. We are. And because we know this, because every single one of us understands from childhood that our time is short, we do something that I think very few species in this room truly understand." He stopped walking. "We hurry." The word sat in the air, small and plain. "We hurry," he said again, "not out of panic, not out of fear, but because we know that if we do not solve a problem today, we might not be here to solve it tomorrow. Every human carries a clock inside them, not a real one but a feeling, a constant quiet knowledge that time is moving and it will not stop for us. And that feeling, that urgency, drives everything we do." He looked up at the Dralith section. The adjudicator mentioned our faster-than-light drive. She said it was based on Velshi wave theory. She is correct. The Velshi developed that theory over the course of 9,000 years of careful, patient study. Beautiful work. Brilliant work. He nodded toward the Velshi section with genuine respect. Humans took that theory and built a working drive in 47 years. The hall stirred. "Not because we are smarter," Elias said quickly. "We are not, but because we did not have 9,000 years. We had one generation, maybe two, before the people who started the project would be gone forever, so they worked harder. They worked faster. They took risks that a longer-lived species would never need to take, and some of those risks failed and people died, but the drive got built." He let that sit for a moment. "The adjudicator also said we are divided, that we argue and fracture and cannot agree. She is right again, but I want to suggest that she is looking at the wrong side of that coin." He held up his scarred hand, turning it slowly. "When a species agrees on everything, it moves in one direction, one path, one idea at a time, and that is powerful. I respect it deeply. But when a species disagrees on everything, it moves in every direction at once, 1,000 paths. 1,000,000 ideas, all competing, all crashing into each other, all fighting to prove they are the best." His voice was still quiet, still calm, still the voice of a man who was not trying to impress anyone. "Most of those ideas fail. Most of those paths lead nowhere. But the ones that survive, the ones that claw their way through all that competition and chaos and noise, those ideas are strong. They have been tested not in a laboratory but in the fire of a species that never stops pushing, never stops questioning, never stops trying to find a better way." He reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small device. It was not impressive. It looked old and scratched and entirely ordinary. "You have all shown me wonderful things today," Elias said. "Star engines and planet shields and communication networks and technologies that took thousands of years to build. They are remarkable, every one of them, and humanity has nothing like that to show you." He activated the device. A single holographic file appeared above the platform. It was not a weapon or a ship or a grand invention. It was a list, just a list, lines of text glowing softly in the air above the human's head. "But I did bring something," he said. He looked at the list, then back at the hall. "This is the official Galactic Emergency Response Record. It is maintained by the Concordance itself. It contains every major disaster, crisis, plague, and catastrophe that has occurred in Concordance space over the last 84 years. He paused. The same 84 years that humanity has been a member. He looked at Salith Voron. The adjudicator asked what permanence we offer, what substance we bring, what we have done with our brief, flickering time among you. His voice did not rise. His expression did not change. But something behind his eyes was burning now, quiet and steady, like a fire that had been banked for a very long time. "Let me show you." The list hung in the air above the platform, glowing in pale blue light. It was long, much longer than anyone had expected. Line after line of text, each one a date, a location, and a brief description of something terrible that had happened somewhere in the galaxy. Disasters, plagues, collapses, wars, the kind of events that shook entire star systems and left scars that lasted for centuries. Elias Morrow looked at the list. Then he looked at the hall. "Year 12 of human membership," he said. He did not read from the list. He spoke from memory. The Veshan famine, a drought caused by a solar shift, killed 80% of the crops on 3 Veshan colony worlds. 400 million people were starving. The Concordance issued a formal call for aid. He paused. 3 species pledged assistance. Ships, food, medical supplies. The pledges were generous. They were also slow. Moving resources across that much space takes time, and time was something the Veshan people did not have. He looked toward the section of the hall where the Veshan delegates sat. They were thin, pale creatures with large, dark eyes, and those eyes were now fixed on him, with an intensity that made the delegates sitting near them shift uncomfortably. One species did not pledge. One species simply came. Within 11 days of the Concordance's call, a human convoy of 214 civilian ships entered the Veshan corridor. They were not military ships. They were cargo haulers, passenger transports, and medical frigates that had been refitted in less than a week. They were crewed entirely by volunteers. The hall was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when people are hearing something they had known once, but had allowed themselves to forget. The Veshan corridor was flooded with radiation from the same solar shift that caused the famine. Every crew member on those ships knew that passing through it would shorten their lives. Human bodies are not good with radiation. It damages us at the deepest level. The doctors told them that the trip through the corridor would cut 15 to 20 years off their lifespans. Elias stopped for a moment. They went anyway, every single one of them. He let the silence hold. 214 ships entered the corridor. 197 came out the other side. 17 were lost to radiation storms, reactor failures, and structural collapse. 831 human beings died before they ever reached the people they were trying to save. The rest delivered enough food and medicine to keep the Veshan colonies alive until the longer-term aid finally arrived, 3 months later. In the Veshan section, one of the delegates lowered her head. Her hands were trembling. Elias moved to the next entry. Year 31, the Gorvan Plague. He did not look at Ambassador Torek, not yet. A previously unknown pathogen appeared on the Gorvan homeworld. It attacked the calcium structures in their bodies, the material that gives them their strength. Within weeks, the strongest species in the galaxy was crumbling. Their warriors could not stand. Their builders could not lift their tools. Their children were born with bodies that broke under their own weight. The hall was very, very still. The Gorvan reached out to the Concordance for medical assistance. The Draelith sent researchers. The Urani sent biological samples. The Velshi offered computational support to model the pathogen. All of this was valuable. All of it was appreciated. but none of it produced a cure. He paused. A human medical team arrived on the Gorvon homeworld 6 weeks after the outbreak began. They were not the most advanced doctors in the galaxy. They did not have the best equipment, but they had something else. They had a way of thinking that came from being a species that had spent its entire history fighting diseases that were always one step ahead of them. They did not look for a perfect solution. They looked for a fast one. He allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. One of the human doctors, a woman named Priya Dasgupta, noticed that the pathogen's structure was similar to a fungal infection that attacked grain crops on Earth. It was not the same, not even close, but the shape was similar, and Dr. Dasgupta had grown up on a farm before she went to medical school. She suggested using a modified version of an agricultural fungicide, a chemical designed to protect wheat, as the base for a treatment. Elias shook his head slightly. Every other species in the research group thought she was out of her mind. A farming chemical to cure a plague. It was absurd. It was unscientific. It was exactly the kind of reckless, cross-disciplinary leap that humans make when they are desperate and running out of time. He looked up at Ambassador Torek. It worked. The modified compound stopped the pathogen within 72 hours. Within 90 days, the plague was over. The Gorvon homeworld survived because a human farmer who became a doctor remembered something about wheat. Torek's massive stone face did not move, but his eyes closed slowly and his head lowered in a gesture that every species in the hall recognized. It was grief. It was gratitude. It was a memory that still hurt after all these years. His own daughter had been among the dying. She was alive now because of that farmer's daughter. Elias did not dwell on it. He moved on. Year 58. The collapse of Relay Station Orion 7, a structural failure caused by a microasteroid impact. 40,000 beings of 6 different species were trapped inside a station that was breaking apart around them. Air was leaking. Power was failing. The station was drifting toward a gravity well that would crush it within days. He scrolled through the list above him without looking at it. 4 species sent engineering teams to assess the situation. They sent probes. They sent drones. They sent long-range scanning equipment to build models of the damage and calculate the safest approach. All very sensible, all very careful, all very slow. His voice tightened just slightly. Humans sent people. 300 rescue operatives launched within hours of the distress call. They did not wait for assessments. They did not wait for models. They put on vacuum suits and they flew to the station, and they started cutting through the wreckage with hand tools when their machines failed. They carried people out on their backs. They sealed breaches with their own bodies when the emergency foam ran out, standing in the gap while the air tried to tear them into space. He stopped walking. He stood completely still. 38,400 people were pulled out of that station alive. The rescue operation took 9 days. 14 human operatives died during the effort. Their names are recorded in the Concordance's own files, if anyone cares to look. He did not say that he had been one of those 300 operatives. He did not mention that the longest scar on his right hand came from holding a metal beam in place for 4 hours while a Velshi family crawled to safety beneath it. He did not think it mattered. The point was not about him. But Torek knew. Torek had read the reports years ago. He looked at the scars on the human's hands and he understood what they meant. Elias moved to the final entry, and for the first time he looked directly at Salith Voron. Year 71, he said, the Dralith border crisis. Something changed in Salith's face. It was small, a tightening around her golden eyes, a slight dimming of her scales. If you were not watching carefully, you would have missed it. A Dralith colony on the outer border was attacked by void pirates. 300,000 civilians, mostly researchers and their families. The colony's defenses were overwhelmed in hours. They sent a distress call to the Concordance. Elias spoke carefully now, each word placed with precision. The concordance classified the attack as an internal Dralith matter. No intervention was authorized. The rules were clear. The procedures were followed, and 300,000 people were left to die. The Dralith delegation sat rigid in their seats. Several of them looked at Salith, whose expression had become perfectly, dangerously blank. A human battle group entered Dralith space without authorization. They had no permission. They had no legal standing. They violated 4 concordance protocols and 2 interspecies treaties. Their commanding officer knew that she would likely face a military tribunal when she returned. She went anyway. He held Salith's gaze. The siege was broken in 4 hours. 300,000 people went home to their families. The human commander was court-martialed. She accepted the punishment without appeal. She said, and this is in the official record, that she would do it again. The hall was silent, not the confused silence of before, not the polite silence of a room waiting for the next speaker. This was the silence of a room that had been struck. Elias looked away from Salith and back at the assembly. "You asked what we offer," he said. "You asked what permanence a short-lived species can bring to an ancient galaxy." His voice was steady and low, and it carried the weight of every name on that list, every ship lost in the Veshan corridor, every hand that had reached into the dark to pull a stranger to safety. Every single time this galaxy bled, we showed up, not because we were asked, not because it was required, not because we had anything to gain, but because there were people who needed help and we could not look away. He picked up his datapad from the platform. "We do not measure our worth in how long we live, adjudicator. We measure it in what we do with the time we have." He set the datapad down again, gently, as if putting a child to bed. "That is our contribution. That is our substance. That is what humans bring to this table." Then he was quiet. The silence lasted 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then Ambassador Torek stood. All 8 feet of ancient stone rose from his seat, and his right fist came up to his chest in a gesture that was not Gorvan. It was human. A salute learned decades ago from the medical team that had saved his daughter's life. A Veshan delegate stood next. Then another. Then a cluster of Urani pressed their tentacles against the glass of their tanks in their species' sign of deepest respect. One by one, like stars appearing in a dark sky, the delegates of the Galactic Concordance rose to their feet. Salith Voron did not stand. She sat perfectly still in her high seat, her scales pale, her golden eyes unreadable, watching the small human on the platform below as the hall filled with the sound of silence breaking. The vote took less than an hour. It was supposed to take a full day, with each species given time to deliberate privately and submit their decision through the encrypted voting system that the Concordance had used for thousands of years. But the delegations did not need a full day. Most of them did not even need the hour. The results appeared on the great display above the central platform. 11 species voted in favor of granting humanity full membership. 2 abstained. 1 voted against. The margin was the widest in Concordance history for any species that had held probationary status. The automated system that processed the votes added a small note at the bottom of the display, stating that no species had ever received this level of support in fewer than 300 years of membership. The note was dry and factual, the way all Concordance records were, but the number spoke for itself. Elias Morrow watched the results from his seat in the lowest ring. He did not stand. He did not raise his arms. He did not celebrate. He simply read the numbers, nodded once, and wrote something on his datapad. Around him, the hall was filled with movement and noise as delegates rose from their seats and began speaking to one another. The formal session was over, and the vast room slowly transformed from a place of ceremony into something more ordinary. A crowd of people heading for the exits, thinking about what they had just witnessed and what it meant. Several delegates stopped by the human section as they passed. A Veshan diplomat. The same one who had lowered her head during Elia's account of the famine convoy, paused at the edge of his row. She did not speak. She simply placed her hand over her heart and held it there for a moment, looking at him with those large dark eyes. Then she walked on. An Urani delegate extended a tentacle through a small opening in its tank and touched the air in Elia's direction, which the translator system registered as a gesture of profound thanks. Two Kreth delegates clicked their mandibles in a rhythm that meant something like, "We remember." Elias acknowledged each of them with a small nod, nothing more. Ambassador Torek did not come down from the upper rings. He remained in his seat long after most of the Gorvan delegation had filed out. He sat with his massive hands flat on his knees and his eyes closed, and anyone who looked at him closely would have seen that the stone of his face was wet. The Gorvan did not cry the way humans did. But moisture sometimes seeped through the cracks in their skin when something moved them deeply enough. And right now, Torek's face was lined with thin streams of mineral water that caught the light from the glass ceiling above. He opened his eyes eventually and looked down at the empty platform where the human had stood. Then he stood slowly and left the hall through a side exit without speaking to anyone. The hall emptied. The lights dimmed to their resting state. The holographic displays shut down one by one. The chairs stood in their silent rows, holding the shapes of the thousands of beings who had sat in them, and the great glass ceiling showed nothing but stars. Elias gathered his datapad and his stylus and put them in his bag. He stood, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the corridor that led to the shuttle bays. The corridor was long and quiet. Most of the delegates had already returned to their ships or retired to the guest quarters on the station's upper levels. Elias walked alone, his boots echoing on the polished floor, passing under lights that activated as he approached and dimmed after he passed. He was halfway to the shuttle bay when he heard footsteps behind him. They were light and precise, the kind of footsteps that made almost no sound but wanted to be heard. He stopped and turned. Salith Voron stood a dozen paces behind him. She was no longer on her platform, no longer bathed in light, no longer surrounded by the weight of the conclave hall. In the plain corridor, under the ordinary lights, she looked smaller than she had on stage. Not physically. She was still taller than Elias by more than a foot, and her scales still shimmered with that restless, shifting color. But something about her posture had changed. The certainty that had carried her through the assessment, that absolute confidence that she was right and the universe agreed with her, was gone. In its place was something quieter and harder to name. They looked at each other. The silence between them was different from the silence in the hall. That silence had been the silence of a crowd holding its breath. This one was the silence of two people standing in an empty hallway with something heavy between them that neither of them could put down. Salith spoke first. "My colony," she said. Her voice was stripped of its public polish. It was just a voice now, clear and direct and carrying the faintest edge of something that might have been pain. "The border attack, you knew." Elias nodded, "Yes. You knew when you walked into the hall today. You knew before I said a single word." "Yes." Her golden eyes searched his face. She was looking for something. Satisfaction, maybe. Triumph. The pleasure of a trap well set. Any sign that he had planned this, that he had waited for her to humiliate herself before pulling the ground out from under her. Any sign that this had been revenge. She did not find it. "Why did you not say it earlier?" she asked. "When I was speaking, when I was tearing your species apart in front of the entire concordance, you could have interrupted. You could have told them right then that humans had saved my colony. It would have destroyed my assessment before I even finished it." Elias shook his head. "That was not the point." "Then what was the point?" "The point was the list," he said simply. "All of it, not just your colony, every entry, every time someone needed help and we came." Salith's scales shifted to a color Elias had not seen before, a deep, uncertain violet that seemed to come from somewhere beneath the surface. "But my colony," she pressed. "In the hall, when you reached that entry, you looked at me. You could have told them that I had a personal connection to it, that the high adjudicator who just dismissed humanity owed her own people's survival to the species she called minor. It would have been the final blow. No one in that room would have listened to me again." "I know," Elias said. "Then why did you not say it?" He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in that same quiet, steady voice that had carried through the great hall and silenced 1,000 aliens, "Because that is not why we do it." Salith stared at him. "We did not save your colony to win an argument 84 years later. We did not save the Gorvon to earn a vote. We did not fly into the Veshan corridor to build a case for membership in your concordance." He paused. "We did those things because people were in danger and we could help. That is the beginning and the end of it. Using your pain as a weapon, even to defend my own species, would have turned something good into something ugly, and I will not do that." Salith was quiet for a long time. The violet in her scales deepened and then slowly began to fade back toward silver. She studied the human in front of her, this small, scarred, impossibly stubborn creature who had stood in a hall full of gods and giants and had refused to play their game. He had not shouted. He had not boasted. He had not taken revenge when it was offered to him on a golden plate. He had simply told the truth and then walked away. She did not understand him. Not fully. Maybe not even close. But for the first time in her long and brilliant life, Salith Voron looked at a human and did not see something lesser. She saw something she could not quite measure, and that was far more unsettling than anything she had encountered in the conclave hall. She raised her right hand and extended 2 fingers toward him, palm facing down. It was a Dralith gesture, old and formal. It was not given to subordinates or to strangers or to species that the Dralith considered beneath them. It was given only to equals. In 6,000 years of concordance membership, the Dralith had offered it to exactly 3 other species. Elias looked at the gesture. He understood what it meant, and instead of trying to copy it, he did something simpler. He reached out and took her hand in his, the way humans do when they meet someone they respect. A handshake, firm and brief, his scarred fingers closing around her smooth, scaled ones for just a moment before letting go. Salith looked at her hand after he released it, then she looked at him. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing left to say. Salith turned and walked back down the corridor, her scales slowly returning to their usual shimmering blue. Elias watched her go, then continued toward the shuttle bay. He was almost at the boarding gate when a voice called out behind him. It was young and nervous, and belonged to a species he did not immediately recognize. A small creature with wide silver eyes and soft gray fur that stood upright on 2 legs and came up to about his chest. "Excuse me," the young alien said, hurrying to catch up. "You are the human representative, Captain Morrow." Elias stopped. "Just Morrow is fine." The alien fell into step beside him, practically bouncing with a kind of anxious energy that reminded Elias of a graduate student approaching a professor after a lecture. "I am a junior delegate from the Tessari observation mission. We are not members of the Concordance yet. We are just here to watch and learn." "All right," Elias said. The Tessari hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been building since the session ended. "Why do humans always run toward the danger? Every story you told in there, your people moved toward the crisis, not away from it. Every other species calculates the risk first. They measure, they plan, they wait, but humans just go." The young alien's silver eyes were wide and genuinely confused. "Why?" Elias reached the boarding gate. His shuttle was waiting on the other side, a small, unremarkable vessel that looked exactly like what it was, a single ship built to carry 1 person home. He thought about the question. He thought about the Veshan corridor and the ships that never came back. He thought about Priya Dasgupta and her wheat fields. He thought about the operatives on Orion 7 and the commander who broke a siege and accepted her punishment without a word of complaint. He thought about every human who had ever looked at something terrible and walked toward it instead of away. Then he looked at the young Tessari and said, "Because someone has to, and we would rather it be us." The Tessari stood at the gate and watched the human board his shuttle. Through the observation window, he saw the small ship detach from the station and turn toward open space. It moved slowly at first, then faster, until it was just a point of light heading toward an unremarkable yellow star on the edge of an unremarkable spiral arm. It was a small ship, carrying a small, brief, fragile creature. And somehow, watching it go, the young Tessari had never seen anything so large.